So thank you, Thomas. I'm going to be speaking about compassion and the more serious side of compassion. So I want to take a minute and just kind of look at your smiling, happy faces because it's going to completely disappear in the next 5 minutes. I love Phoenix coffee, but you should have had a distillery here. Yeah. We could have had Bloody Marys too. That would have been better. As Thomas mentioned, last month I was at the Effective Altruism Conference in San Francisco, and I'll be talking today about that conference and about the effective altruism movement in general and how it intersects with compassion, but specifically compassion in action. At this conference, there were many opportunities to talk with other attendees, and it was a complete blast. I was really surprised by the quality of the conversations, and so often conversations would go something like this. 2017 would come up and everyone would acknowledge, oh my God, it's challenging, bizarre, sometimes depressing, but almost immediately would shift from that into, yeah, but the world's a mess, right? Always has been, always will be. There are cool things going on. Here's what I'm doing. What are you doing? Have you heard of this organization? They're doing a presentation at 1 o'clock. You got to go. Is there somebody there I can introduce you to? So it was like 3 solid days of that. And it was like drinking from a fire hose. I felt really happy to be there. Despite the very serious and sometimes heartbreaking, challenging work that was being done, the tone at the conference was joyous and optimistic, not you'd expect it to be sad and full of despair because they're really working, many of these organizations, on the toughest challenges facing all of us. But somehow they were embracing this challenge with such optimism, cautious optimism appropriately, but also joy. And it made a big impression on me. So EA Global, EA being Effective Altruism, is one of 3 conferences, the one in San Francisco. In North America, there's one in Boston, 2 in North America, Boston and San Francisco, 1 in London each year. I am not remotely an expert on effective altruism. It would be best to think of this morning as kind of a travel log. I was a tourist in the land of effective altruism. I'm going to tell you about it. If I'd just gotten back from South by Southwest or Coachella and I was all excited about the music I saw, I'd be doing the same thing. So this is not broadly about all nonprofits and charitable organizations. It's about effective altruism. There are so many completely awesome nonprofits in the world, many of them right here in Cleveland. And there are some people involved in them here, friends from the Cleveland area, and we support them, and I hope that you will too. These are just a few of them, the folks that I know well. Anything I say about effective altruism is certainly not deemed to be at the exclusion of other great organizations you might already be supporting. So I talked with Thomas about my intention for this talk. There is a sweet side of compassion, and I decided it was too easy to go there for you and for me. The people in this audience are open-hearted, concerned with social justice and social impact, and you have many sources to go to for inspiration. I wanted to go into the more serious side that arises when compassion connects with action. So Thomas gave me his blessing on this approach. I did watch the blood run out of his face a little bit, but he gave me the go-ahead. So I'm going to take advantage of your good nature and be intentionally provocative, and some of what I'm going to share will be hard to hear. We'll be talking about things like who to save when you can't save everyone, how aid organizations around the world think about the value of a human life, and so on. Hard questions to think about and much harder to answer. And there are no perfect, ideal, or easy solutions, needless to say, but the questions matter deeply. Sometimes we, with very best intentions, give very generously and mostly from the heart and forget the head. Forget to include research, analysis, due diligence, and healthy skepticism, as we almost certainly would when buying a car and checking that out on Consumer Reports, or buying a house and researching at Zillow. Combining head and heart was a very common theme at this Effective Altruism conference, and the compassion I heard about there, I think could best be described as fierce compassion, bordering on fearless. It was thought-provoking and inspiring. So, we're not going that direction. So let's start simply. This will be a little bit of pointing out the obvious, but it's at the heart of the topic and worth spending a minute or two on. Everyone can read that, so I'm not going to read through this. But I would call your attention to the words that I've made bold and underlined. They're all feelings, awareness, beliefs. I like this quote, and it's a nice transition between these two slides. True compassion means not only feeling another's pain, but also being moved to help relieve it. Which takes us naturally to altruism. I'll give you a second to read that. I'm not going to read it out loud, but notice the difference between those two slides. They're certainly connected. Compassion and altruism very closely aligned. But I like to think that altruism transcends and includes compassion. It's compassion plus action. So I first encountered effective altruism about 18 months ago. I was reviewing some podcasts by a guy named Tim Ferriss. Great podcasts if you haven't checked them out. And I remember reading the blurb about Will MacAskill, one of the co-founders of Effective Altruism. He was then a 27-year-old tenured professor at Oxford in philosophy. And I was taking a walk, and I remember reading that thinking, this could be really boring, but I'll take a listen for 5 minutes and then probably blow out and listen to something else. 2 hours later, I was still listening to this podcast. It was a very long podcast, and it had a serious impact on me. I really liked this guy a lot. And he was not what I expected at all. He was funny, grounded, practical, down-to-earth, thoughtful. And he talked about half the time in this podcast about the effective altruism movement, and it really did pique my interest. He wrote a book called Doing Good Better, which had come out just before that podcast. So I ordered the book and read through it. It got into the similar information, but at greater depth. There he is. I applied to the Effective Altruism Conference in spring of 2016. I was not accepted, and I handled that rejection very badly. I trashed the organization to everyone I knew and on Facebook and Twitter, as you can well imagine. A healthy response. Not true. I applied again this year and was accepted, I think mostly as a result of the fact that they held it at a larger venue. So, what the hell is effective altruism? Here's the definition from their website. Effective altruism is about answering one simple question. How can we use our resources to help others the most? Rather than just doing what feels right, we use evidence and careful analysis to find the very best causes to work on and most effective organizations doing that work. But it's no use answering the question unless you act on it. Effective altruism is about following through. It's about being generous with your time and your money to do the most good you can. As the phrase suggests, effective altruism has two parts, and I want to be clear on what each part means. As they use the term, altruism simply means improving the lives of others. Many people believe that altruism must involve sacrifice, but if you can do good while maintaining a comfortable life for yourself, that's more sustainable, ideal, and easily qualifies as effective altruism. Second part is effectiveness, meaning doing the most good with whatever resources you have, time or money. Importantly, effective altruism is not just about making a difference or doing some amount of good. It's about trying to do the most good you can. Determining whether something is effective means recognizing that some ways of doing good are better than others. The point of this is not to lay blame or to claim some ways of doing good are unworthy. Rather, it's simply to work out which ways of doing good are best and do those first whenever possible. And to fully employ both the head and the heart. Either one alone is insufficient. So, in effective altruism, there is much emphasis on evidence analysis and scientific approaches. Why? Well, I'm going to start with a story that got shared at the conference. So this man is Trevor Field, a middle-aged South African man who'd worked for years in advertising. He'd been traveling in semi-remote and poor areas in Africa and watched the women of a rural village wait for hours next to a windmill-powered water pump. There had been no wind that day, but the women who had trekked for miles still needed to bring water back to their homes. So they simply sat and waited for the water to flow. Field had been struck by how unfair this was. There simply must be a better way to do this, he thought. So he did some research and eventually ended up purchasing the patent for a solution he felt would really make a difference. The play pump. Instead of the typical hand pump or windmill pump found in many villages in poor countries, Field's pump, named the play pump, doubled as a playground merry-go-round. Children would play on the pump, on the merry-go-round, which as it spun would pump clean water from deep underground to a storage tank. No longer would the women of the village need to walk miles to draw water using a hand pump or wait in line at a windmill-powered pump on a still day. Mr. Field created a company to manufacture the play pump, generated a ton of publicity, including the support of the folks listed at the bottom there, and attracted many tens of millions of dollars of investments from individuals, corporations, and foundations. In 2005, PBS Frontline ran a wildly positive series on the product and the rollout. Brilliant, creative, innovative solution, right? Well, it turns out they hadn't tested them thoroughly before rolling them out. The idea had seemed to all parties like such a no-brainer, it was easy to love. Funders, promoters, and manufacturing had gone full steam ahead and created and placed many hundreds of play pumps across Africa. So when PBS Frontline went back in 2007, only 13 remained functional. And these are the reasons the kids didn't like them. They hadn't really tested them thoroughly. They were hard, unlike a regular merry-go-round or spin around, there was no momentum, so you couldn't push it and jump on. You had to keep pushing it. So they'd lose interest almost immediately. Then the women in the village needed to push these, which they hated. It was much harder than what they'd been using before. When the pumps broke down, it was a closed steel casing that couldn't be repaired quickly or easily. So these were inferior in almost every way to what had preceded them, a simple hand pump, except that it was 4 times as expensive. So on the balancing head and heart, the play pumps over there, and I love continuums. You're going to see some more of these. So I'm going to contrast that with another story. Michael Kramer and Rachel Glennister shared concerns about extreme poverty, and both had studied math and sciences in high school and college and had spent time in environments where testing hypotheses was fairly rigorous and commonplace. Both had spent time also in Kenya doing volunteer work. They connected with an organization called ICS, Investing in Children and Their Societies, a nonprofit working with schools in poor African communities, and agreed to help them with a project with a very specific focus: improving attendance and test scores in the schools they were working in at that point in time. They introduced something that had not been done up to that point at all. They introduced randomized controlled trials, the gold standard in scientific testing. First, they tested adding additional textbooks. Most of the classrooms had only 1 textbook for every 30 children. So it seemed like a no-brainer. Then they introduced flip charts. I'll tell you about the results in a moment. Then they introduced flip charts, allowing the teachers to tailor and customize the programs and lessons for those kids. And then they increased the number of teachers. Again, seemed like a complete no-brainer. Well, those results were discouraging. No significant improvement. With the textbooks, they only produced outcomes with the high-achieving students. With the flip charts, surprisingly, it had no impact whatsoever. An increasing number of teachers had a very small impact, but it cost way too much given the impact. But they refused to believe there was no way to improve the education and attendance of Kenyan children. And then a friend of theirs suggested they consider deworming. The deworming had dramatic impact. It was very inexpensive. It resulted very early on in a 25% reduction in absenteeism, a decrease in other health-related problems as a result of impaired immune systems. In 10 years, they found that those who had been dewormed were working an extra 3.4 hours per week and earning 20% additional income compared to those who had not been dewormed. So a resounding success that surprised them. In 2007, they co-founded Deworm the World Initiative, providing technical assistance to the governments of developing countries so they can launch their own programs. That charity has provided over 40 million deworming treatments in the developing world. And they succeeded in part because they did not assume that they already knew the answer going in. They tested their ideas before rolling them out. This particular organization was at the conference, and there were about 100 other organizations. Each one had just as fun, inspiring, and interesting story as the next. So in the balancing head and heart, and I'm just going to jam in some continuums here, even if they don't fit. A nice solution. We don't want to go too far either side, right? All the way to the head makes no sense in charitable or philanthropic work. You want to balance the two. So there are 5 questions at the heart of effective altruism, and they are used often in finding the best ways of doing good better. They may seem obvious, but the further you dig, the more challenging they get. I'll read through them quickly. How many people benefit and by how much? Is this the most effective thing you can do? Is this area neglected? What would have happened otherwise? And what are the chances of success, and how good would success be? We are going to hit these way too fast, so forgive me, I'm going to talk faster than I probably should talk, but we have a lot of ground to cover. I just want to give you a little bit of taste of how these questions unfold in the context of this particular effective altruism network. And also worth keeping in mind, at this organization and within effective altruism in general, there are robust debates about how to deploy, how to think about the questions, how to answer the questions, and once the questions are answered, how to deploy the solutions. So if this comes across a little overly simplistic, it's really for the sake of brevity. So first question, how many people benefit and by how much? So it costs $50,000 to train one guide dog and the blind recipient. Compare this with curing blindness caused by trachoma, a contagious bacterial infection of the eye that affects millions of people in many of the poorest and most rural areas of 41 second and third world countries. It's responsible for the blindness or visual impairment of about 1.9 million people, and it causes 1.4% of all blindness worldwide, according to the World Health Organization. The same $50,000 that would provide a guide dog and training would treat between 400 and 2,000 patients. In a world where no organizations or individuals have unlimited resources, by what criteria do we make these decisions? Again, I don't have answers. I'm throwing out questions, and some of these are really thorny. We could debate just this one for the next half hour, needless to say. So, the Gates Foundation homepage has this message there all the time. All lives have equal value. It's a lovely sentiment and easy to smile and nod to, but what does that mean when there's work to be done? We'll be pursuing that in some of these questions. So question number 2, is this the most effective thing you can do? The assumption within the question is this: we don't need to resign ourselves to funding programs of merely average effectiveness. We can deliberately choose to fund only the very best programs, which are often many times more effective than typical organization, and which enables us to do a tremendous amount of good. We can do this research on our own, or we can lean on organizations like this one. Again, just an example, they were at the conference I attended last month. GiveWell, they're sort of consumer reports for nonprofits. GiveWell is a nonprofit dedicated to finding outstanding giving opportunities and publishing the full details of their analysis to help donors decide where to give. Unlike charity evaluators, organizations or sites like GuideStar, that focus solely on financials and on assessing administrative or fundraising costs, GiveWell conducts in-depth research aiming to determine how much good a given program accomplishes in terms of lives saved, lives improved, etc., per dollar spent. There's a side conversation we could have about whether or not being able to quantify something that specifically is fair. It will exclude really important missions, but for this organization, that's what they do. Rather than try to rate as many charities as possible, they focus on the few charities that stand out by their criteria in order to find and confidently recommend the best giving opportunities. An individual can give to them and they'll redeploy it. All of their overhead is covered by a philanthropic organization. Or you can go, their information is very broad at the site. They're transparent and you can look at their organizations. If there's one that's of interest to you, you can give directly there. They tend to focus in a few key areas, and they tend to be global poverty, social justice, animal welfare, and a few other causes. Question number 3, is this area neglected? Part of this question considers this: what is already getting lots of attention and donations, and what is out of sight, out of mind, but still important and deserving of help? There were lots of discussions at this conference about that, and it's hard not to think about it now with what's been going on in the U.S., in Texas and Florida, the forest fires out west that make the news and they tug at our heartstrings, and most of us quickly, easily want to do whatever we can to help. However, well, I'll continue on with the slide. I don't want this to be a 90-minute conversation. So in 2011, there was an earthquake in Japan. There were millions without electricity. 127,000 buildings collapsed, and over 15,000 people died. A year earlier, in January of 2010, an earthquake occurred in Haiti. 150,000 people died, and over 200,000 homes and businesses collapsed. So consider this. Both countries received the same international aid, wildly generous. Japan was 1,000 times richer than Haiti. 4 days after the earthquake, Japan's Red Cross requested that external funding stopped. They had ample funds and couldn't deploy any more money. Needless to say, Haiti had the opposite problem. In 2008, an earthquake hit Sichuan, China. It killed 87,000 people, 5 times as many as the Japanese earthquake. I had never heard of it. My guess is most of you had never heard of that before. It was not widely publicized, but those were human lives. So which of these areas could have used more or different assistance? How do we think about that next time a disaster arises? Or, between disasters, given that every day 18,000 children die around the world from preventable causes, more than died in the Japanese earthquake. Again, no easy answers, but the question's worth considering. And this isn't the spot in the presentation where the cocktails would have been really nice. Next time. Question number 4, what would have happened otherwise? So if nothing had been done on a particular project or intervention, what would have happened? I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. It was a long time ago. It was a documentary filmed in the late 70s called Scared Straight about a group of juvenile delinquents and their 3-hour session with actual convicts. Filmed at Rahway State Prison in New Jersey, a group of inmates known as lifers berate, scream at, and terrify the young offenders in an attempt to scare them straight, hence the film's title. so that those teenagers will avoid prison life. At film's end, the teenagers say that they have decided they don't want to end up in jail. It won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1978. It also won Emmy Awards for Outstanding Individual Achievement, Informational Program, and Outstanding Informational Program. So you know where this is going, right? In April of 1978, James Finkenauer, a professor at the Rutgers School of Criminal Justice, began a test of the Scared Straight program using a control group, something that had not previously been done. 9 high-quality studies were done, assessing the progress of 1,000 juveniles. 2 showed no effect, and 7 showed increased rates of criminality by nearly 60% compared to doing nothing. The program was well-intentioned, but ultimately more harmful than doing nothing. So sometimes this is an outcome, and it's important to test for it. This is the last of the 5 questions. What are the chances of success, and how good would success be? The discussions at the conference around this particular question mostly, though not exclusively, revolved around low probability events, but events that, if they occur, would be disastrous. And here's just one example. The Fukushima nuclear power plant experienced a massive failure as a result of the earthquake in 2011 that I mentioned earlier. The severity of the disaster had been assumed to be so wildly unlikely that no planning for it was ever done. They were correct that the probability of a catastrophe was very, very small, but they equated small to 0, forgetting that if it happened, the cost would be staggering. In this case, more than 1,000 lives and billions of dollars. So it would have been, in retrospect, worth taking extra precautions, even though the risk was very, very small. This connects most conspicuously currently to our problems associated with, or challenges associated with, environment, climate change, artificial intelligence risks, nuclear war, and other high-risk areas. If you're interested in more info on really any of these questions, the Effective Altruism site is a great source, effectivealtruism.org. And Will McCaskill's book is really terrific, and they dive much deeper into this. So I'm almost done. I've saved my most preposterous slides for last. There are a couple of quick thoughts I'd like to leave you with, related to the challenges and discomfort we all encounter when compassion moves into action. These organizations are some of the ones listed at the site that I'll connect with. So I have a friend in Seattle that calls these concentric circles domains of concern, and he talks about them on 2 different levels. On a simpler level, on a simple personal development level, we start life as babies and toddlers, and that inner circle, and then as we get older, our caring extends to those around us little by little. First to our family, and then our friends, and then our community, perhaps our country, and then the world. But there is another level, and this is going to be a too brief description of it, but there's another level, a deeper level that one can think about this relative to effective altruism and really any kind of charitable or philanthropic volunteering or giving. It goes to our sense of identity and a sense of the sacred interconnectedness of all peoples everywhere. When we think of the Gates Foundation question, all lives have equal value, how do we think about those in the outer circles? All lives have equal value. It raises some really difficult and really provocative questions. Very broadly speaking, the further out from the center of the circle we go, the greater the discomfort. It's worth putting some awareness around that and connecting it to our own decisions. Okay, another continuum, last one. Well, next to the last one, 2 more. This one is a discomfort continuum. On the left, there are the things we all tend to do, and usually without great difficulty. As you move further to the right, it gets harder and harder for a long list of reasons, including how large the problems are, how far away from us the people are, etc. So I talked with Thomas about this a week or maybe 2 weeks ago, and Thomas had talked with it about his brother who is a priest. His brother suggested that extreme and selfless compassion is best embodied by Jesus, who made the ultimate sacrifice, good for others and tragically bad for him. Because I'm me, I had to put this on a continuum at one end. For the sake of this conversation, I'm going to call this extreme discomfort. And the opposite end, something super comfortable. Extreme low risk. There's probably something further to the left, but this seemed close enough. So most of us can't sustainably move too far to the right. But there is a range, and I've labeled it effective altruism, but it's really all altruism, right? In the middle, if we can't give and give joyously and then go about our lives, it won't be sustainable. So that balance of head and heart and an intentional move into as much discomfort as we can manage and still be sustainable and joyous in our giving. That came up over and over again at this conference. And I hope I've conveyed a little of that in this talk. If I haven't, my bad. So in closing, after all said and done, these really are the three most important things about effective altruism. Excitement about doing the most good, taking a scientific approach, and most of all, taking action. You guys have been great. Thank you very much.